As the Metal Gear series, and necessarily these videos, progressed, its string of themes evolved and grew into an interconnected web of ideas and intra-world continuity. They germinated over real-world years while occupying points from the 1930s to 2000s within the game's own reality. After a pit stop in prequel territory, Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots was announced in 2005, promising to wrap the whole thing up. This is the first entry in the series to begin with the promise to answer rather than ask. Kojima wanted to end the series at MGS3, and before that MGS2, but began development on 4 after pressure from fans to follow up on story threads from Metal Gear Solid 2. He also wasn't meant to direct the game, still being heavily involved, just not at the helm, soon caving again to fan pressure, stepping up once more. By the time Metal Gear Solid 4 released on the PS3, Metal Gear was over 20 years old, which is an important detail to remember. When Kojima was 13, his father passed, and he cited this as strengthening his resolve to become a filmmaker, eventually transitioning to game development after university. 20 years into his career, and like many of his characters, he was pulled back to the battlefield. His just happened to be Metal Gear itself. And this time, returning would mean facing the unresolved tension his main character, Solid Snake, has with his father. Which makes for an interesting cocktail of motivation. Was Kojima reluctant to make MGS4 because it would mean confronting something he didn't feel ready for? Or because it would be too obvious, too easy to give people what they want? Or because he wouldn't be able to do something truly new, constrained by a 20-year-old framework for gameplay and theme? If you look at typical metrics for success, none of that conflict seemed to matter. He overcame it. Reviews were incredibly positive, the game sold well, and it became the only game ever released for the PlayStation 3. Yet in the time since, Metal Gear Solid 4 has become pretty polarizing. Many fans realized they didn't want all their questions answered, and the monkey paw curled on Kojima's deal with the devil to have Guns of the Patriots be literally the only game on the PS Triple, as it's never left the system in the over 15 years since. And so its legacy is odd. Everything was working in its favor to have it stand the test of time as the biggest, best thing around. New hardware, back to the current day, back in control of Solid Snake, stellar production values and a relevant wartime setting for thematic exploration. Yet as someone who only got into Metal Gear after all the main series of games were out, I never played MGS4 until I started making this video. The way it was talked about, combined with being confined to old hardware I didn't own, made it come across as weirdly inessential, which really shouldn't be the case for your big, continuity-ending epic. Fortunately, over the last couple years I've been playing the games in order, so should also be able to approach Metal Gear Solid 4 on its own merits. So let's see how it holds up. Like MGS1 with Gene, 2 with Meme and 3 with Scene, MGS4 has its own single-word overarching theme: sense. Sense generally gets translated within the script to will, meant to represent someone's wants, the will they wish to impose on the world. Typically, the previous games' title screens have been used to succinctly establish this theme. In MGS1 we see Snake surrounded and lost amongst code, alluding to genetic code, but also information broadly, emphasizing his lack of control. MGS2 then evokes similar imagery but changes the face from snakes to Raidens after a certain point in the game, typifying its subversiveness and the fickleness of memes. MGS3 lets you control the context or scene of the little confrontation that plays out, changing speed, color, pattern, and so on. In MGS4, the title screen is in conversation with previous games in a much more literal way than even MGS2. We see a grey-haired Snake wandering into the graveyard where the boss was buried at the end of Snake Eater. He then pulls a gun out, kneels, and begins to bring it to his mouth before things fade out. Snake's will is manifesting as an escape here, but what he's escaping is entirely self-referential and not as symbolic. It derives its power from its place as the endpoint, literally invoking that by reusing MGS3's final image. And while that's not necessarily bad, it is an omen for things to come. At the very least, it makes you wonder how things get to this point, with the music exemplifying the contrast between what's familiar and what isn't. The treacly guitar feels mournful, whether for the boss or Snake himself, yet the drums insistently pulse away, almost refusing to let Snake's journey end just yet. The spare but impactful title screen is interspersed with a mix of in-universe advertisements for private military contractors and other TV vignettes like game shows, interviews, and so on. They're appropriately tasteless, but all make the same point in practically the same way. This world has devolved into endless war, to the point where the visual language of conflict and entertainment has become interchangeable. They're fun, but as we'll see shortly, you don't see anything the game itself doesn't feel the need to yell at us about. Before the game proper starts, you can view the briefing for Act 1. It begins with Sunny, Olga's daughter, cracking eggs into a pan and reciting some numbers to the melody of the main Metal Gear Solid theme. These numbers are the 370th to 390th decimal points of pi. Part of why pi as a number is significant is because it has an infinite number of decimal places while never settling into a decimal pattern, like 999 repeating for example. Sunny's repetition of numbers so deep into the decimal representation of pi does a couple things. On the surface it displays her intelligence, as she's also a genius programmer because no Metal Gear character can just be normal. But they also take on an interesting narrative meaning. The tension between pi's anomalous elements never resolve and yet also never settle. Things remain in flux indefinitely. This is reminiscent of Big Boss's wish for a society which remains in constant struggle, fighting and agitating against itself infinitely, while similarly to pi, never easing into predictability. We're clued into the fact that this vision of the world has been realized, and for some time now, by the use of the 370th to 390th decimal points, as opposed to like the first 10 or 20. At the same time, 390 is a lot less than infinite, so the irrational number can still be interrupted, perhaps by the very mission we're to be briefed on. Colonel Campbell outlines the state of the world to Snake. The events of MGS2 and the subsequent backlash resulted in a movement to privatize military operations through private military companies, or PMCs. Along the way, the Pentagon developed a highly intricate system for monitoring and collecting the data of soldiers, giving private and public militaries greater control of the battlefield and how it operates. This has only fueled the further proliferation of PMCs, with 5 of them becoming big enough to qualify as global military powers. These 5 groups are operated by a dummy corporation called Outer Heaven. Liquid is back by way of Ocelot, imposing his will through only a single arm, hoping to finally realize the future Big Boss wanted. The world of MGS4 is one of consequence and shocking continuity. It, as promised, follows on from MGS2 and so has a landscape shaped by even the absurd, abstract ideas of that game. Necessarily then, all pretense must be dropped. What was supposed to be conspiratorial and shadowy in earlier games is simply the status quo within normal society now. The military-industrial complex is the world economy, in a more brazen, cynical way than it has been in our own world for the past 20 years. Liquid Ocelot's been spotted in the Middle East, so it's Snake's mission to sneak into a local conflict disguised as a PMC operative, with the hope of making contact with your informants, Rat Patrol. As the briefing proceeds, dialogue is used for expository purposes, while the camera focuses on character. You get a look at Otacon and Snake's flying command center, essentially operating above the system, presumably as philanthropy, though it's not specified. You see Sunny nervously offering her poorly cooked eggs around the room, clearly skittish and unsure of herself, while Otacon remains focused on his work, notably older and self-assured. Campbell and Snake ignore Sunny, too wrapped up in the familiarity of the cadence of the conversation, so much like old times. There's this impression that everything's playing in real time, the dialogue rarely stops for something unrelated, which helps ground things. It's for the best, the stakes are clearly laid out and the heightened state of the world makes them feel more immediate, so the game needs something to keep it tethered to a modicum of normalcy, and the presentation of the briefings does that. Snake's apparent old age is not really remarked on, it remains a mystery, with his outlook instead getting focus. He takes a moment to answer and finds himself asking less questions. Like the player, he's more wizened and knowledgeable, but beyond how the player reconciles themselves within him, he has actual agency. It's not a foregone conclusion that he must accept the mission, and that power is evident in how he interacts with Campbell. At the same time, there is a sense of inevitability to the mission. So many things are coming back around that it's just logical for Snake to get involved again, and so he does. However, like I said, in less of a compulsory way than before, and it's impressive that the game can capture that nuance. Upon starting up the game, we see the will that has been enforced upon the world. Shots of crumbled buildings, a town with no heartbeat, the quiet drummed over by approaching vehicles holding soldiers. As though these places only exist to accommodate war now. The pained strings are like a languishing death rattle. The world of old is dying slowly, losing all facilities but those that help it express pain.
War has changed.
We then hear Snake's monologue. He succinctly and more poetically establishes much of what the briefing has. Through his narration, he's ascribed narrative authority, trusted to tell us what we need to know, helping us, as people who've played the previous games, feel in step with him. The camera asserts a character of its own during this scene. Like in some sequences from MGS3, most prominently naked Snake's initial encounter with Ocelot, there's a distinct handheld quality. It shakes not just from the action around it, but the person who we presume to be holding it. Additionally, things are not very deliberately cinematic in a traditional sense. Shots are dominated by subjects just a little too close, filmed through discrete windows at odd, obscuring angles. Or they're filmed from a distance. This dichotomy implies the camera is being set up removed from the action or right amongst it. never in that perfect middle ground which allows you to frame everything just how you'd like. Within the game's world, there is no literal camera operator, of course, but MGS4 is leveraging the language of film as it's implicitly understood by the audience to reinforce what Snake's saying. Whether you observe war from afar or take part directly yourself, everyone's still just spending all their time thinking about war. As the monologue nears its end, we see our first glimpse of combat. It comes as a detached, impersonal bullet flying in off screen to hit someone in the head, tumbling out of the truck. It doesn't even really matter who fired the bullet because they're hardly a person, so controlled by the ID system that soldiers now exist as merely a vessel for the will of that system. It's a really powerful opening, with the recursive, endless cycle of this new society induced by Snake's repeating of the war has changed mantra. There's a lot of scene setting and structural thematic work that's really cleverly and efficiently established. The fact that the consequences of MGS2's mania can be translated so seamlessly to MGS4 narratively is quite impressive. The transition to gameplay is similarly seamless in that the camera simply shifts into place and the UI fades in, but outside of that, things prove clunky and ill-considered. You're let loose onto this active battlefield and given a minute to test out movement, which is good as things have changed a little. But after like 45 seconds, control is then wrested from you and Snake is made to crawl under a nearby truck. You then get a small cutscene, get given a gun, walk forward slightly and get another cutscene. Gecko, a small unmanned Metal Gear-like varietal, swarm the area. You have to quickly evade them, heading north. The problem with this, and the whole section, is that the parameters for play have not been established at all. You're immediately told how to use lethal weapons, while Otacon also stresses that this is a stealth mission. The idea that stealth is at all possible during an active firefight seems absurd, and the game makes no effort to actually elucidate how it functions. How can you measure a guard or Gecko's awareness of you when it's actively firing at other combatants, in the process regularly turning and changing focus, not falling into observable patterns of movement that stealth games are built off? This friction does reinforce plot beats. Stealth and espionage seem pointless in such a boldly degraded world where war rules everything, but this isn't a concept the game needs to hit you with right now. All the previous games use their initial areas to establish how stealth engagements work, how spaces are navigated, constructed, and then surveyed by guards. Think about the simple grid structure in Shadow Moses' entrance, or the first few screens of Snake Eater with no guards, focusing instead on the survival mechanics. These are both games which use the abrasiveness of some of their systems to further theme, but they understand that a player won't be able to appreciate that before they even know how to play the game. The first encounters in Guns of the Patriots made me think I had missed something. The story implications of play were the furthest thing from my mind. Giving me an automatic unsilenced weapon so quickly also made me wonder what the game's priorities were. Should my first instinct be combat? This only added further confusion, working against itself. Fortunately, it's not an expansive section, but it really starts things off poorly. As Snake flees the Gecko in a cutscene, we get the now standard reveal shot, echoing MGS 2 and 3. Typically, it's a moment of catharsis, a dramatic release of energy to cement that you managed to infiltrate the area of focus and can truly start your mission. This time it comes mid-encounter and exists primarily to highlight how Snake has changed and the culture with him. The new normal is exemplified by Snake foregoing the cardboard box to blend in, using his Octo camo instead. As the Gecko leave, we see a vista of the conflict and finally the title drop. A really interesting stylistic choice in MGS4 is the use of a calligraphic font for its credits, main title, and act titles. This is a stark departure from the series' tried and true sans serif fonts, used to emphasize the spaces you're sneaking through, while intonating towards the speculative technology at play through details like rounded corners or slanted edges. The starkest difference in calligraphy compared to a font is of course the fact that someone has to physically write it down, which I think is the reason for the choice. Traditionally written with a brush and black ink, Japanese calligraphy gives the author one chance to draw the glyphs on the page. In that way it preserves a moment in time and in turn the author's will. Whether that's shaky lines which may imply a lack of confidence, errant splotches of ink denoting sloppy technique, or perfect fluid lettering that signals composure, every execution captures something. Beyond the direct thematic parallel, it makes for a striking contrast. At first it's a tad out of place and jarring, but the use of calligraphy conjures up the 1400-year history of the art form within Japan, and so as much as the world of the Guns of the Patriots has been talked about as something new and different, it's at once familiar and human. We've spent all of history at war with each other, and so the idea that something like calligraphy is out of place amongst it is ludicrous. If history's anything to go by, war's one of the only constants we have, so everything goes with it. Part of what makes the opening so frustrating from a gameplay standpoint is that the typical teaching session comes immediately after, and it's really good. It's essentially two corridors which run parallel to each other, one interior and one exterior, with small alcoves and moments of overlap along the way. The biggest priority imparted by level design here is how spaces function. The streets naturally contain the action and allow it to be dictated quite strictly, but it isn't static. Previously, guards were essentially single units which happened to overlap in their pathing, only collaborating with each other in the case of an alert. But in MGS4 they tend to move in groups, rotating to cover multiple angles at once, more arcing around entire spaces rather than staying confined to obvious routes dictated by geometry. In this initial street there's also a tank on Overwatch, providing a different avenue of surveillance. And as you progress past where it's planted, the guards and the tank itself change their patrols, meaning that you have to consider what's behind you as well. It's a really cool choice that makes your progress in a rather linear space feel non-linear. Guns of the Patriots isn't as open as Snake Eater, but also not as prescriptive as MGS 1 or 2. It blends the two styles by augmenting how guards act. It's really compelling and a totally new type of tension for sneaking. Throughout all these videos, I've talked about the stealth routine for gameplay, how each game establishes a list of tools you can use and actions you can perform that the player then develops a routine around for their engagement with a space. You think about what you have at your disposal, the space around you, and devise a plan to come out on top. Guns of the Patriots, with its more dynamic, yet narrower spaces, doesn't allow for those same moments of quiet observation all the time. While playing, I had this prevailing sense that once I started to advance, I had to be thinking of where I was going next, a compulsion to keep on the move. This feeling is fitting for what are supposed to be live battlefields. You never feel safe, and you just want to be able to move on. The Octo Camo is purpose-built for what this new approach does to gameplay. Without the same planning and routine work and MGS4's more constrained colour palette, you can't scope out what camo will be needed for your route. So, using the Octo Camo, you just need to stay still on any given surface for a couple seconds to immediately take on the texture of that surface, giving you the optimal camo rating. This also de-emphasizes the camo index generally, which makes sense as these spaces are less likely to have pass-through cover such as grass. Your movement has been updated to match as well. As a result of the changes, gameplay has necessarily become a little more reactive and fast-paced, so you're not only given a crouch walk, but multiple angled rolls and the ability to flip over and aim your weapon when prone. These techniques can appear superfluous, but they do come in handy along the way. Only problem is you have to pull them off on a PS3 controller, which is light and flimsy in the hand with its annoying concave sticks and triggers which arc on a downwards angle, meaning your fingers actively slip off them when holding the button down. No wonder no one made games for this fucking thing. After navigating the battlefield, you pick up a few more tools. First is Metal Gear Mark II, a successor to Metal Gear from Snatcher. It's a little robot Otacon controls from the Nomad, in which the player can then deploy during gameplay to scope out locations, stun guards, and more. You also get the Solid Eye, which gives you a more in-depth radar as well as a few different vision modes, including a heads up as to whether combatants are hostile to you or not. Then lastly you get a Trank and Pistol, both silenced. You're now equipped with the core tools that will be at your disposal. Ultimately it rounds out well. Mark II and the Solid Eye are considered choices which have their own limitations and strengths purposefully designed for the specifics of stealth in MGS4. For example, the Solid Eye's radar gives you specificity in a close vicinity, telling you where noise is coming from in the surrounding space, and then abstracts things for the general area, showing small dots and no world geometry in the top right. This complements the more tangential improvisational style of gameplay. These details are illuminated first in the small area right after getting these new tools, but then again once you find yourself underground, nearing the point where your informant should be. The confined corridors ensure the limits of the play space are always visible, not just helping you discern how the radars work, but personalizing gameplay in the process. Up until now, the other combatants have felt, perhaps appropriately, single-minded, like their death just meant that a script has ended, and less like a life has. But now you hear them wail without the gunfire, have some sort of conversation, do anything other than just fight. This is the context under which you meet Drebin. Drebin breaks the ID locks on guns and then brokers them around, which is handy for someone outside the system like Snake. He gives you an M4 as a gift and you see Snake inspect it really closely. This is something he's done before in the game, examining a weapon in detail. Metal Gear often uses its weapons to help ground the games in some sense of reality, so maybe this is just more gun porn type stuff, but there could be another couple angles. On a character level, it speaks to Snake's neutrality within these conflicts, wanting to skirt the system and at the same time becoming intensely paranoid over his life. But this is something he does as Drebin and Snake discuss how customizable the gun is, and that Snake can't pull the trigger due to his older generation nanomachines. Ignoring how hand-wavy that explanation is, it perhaps ties into some meta-commentary. Between Metal Gear Solid 1 in 1998 and Guns of the Patriots in 2008, video games made further progress in fidelity as shooters became viable on console. When this game was in development, Call of Duty and Halo weren't just centering extreme violence, but building extrinsic systems of affirmation into the experience. More arcadey point systems, player progression through XP and skills, audio and visual elements, and finally a focus on multiplayer meant that games were prioritizing making a person feel good for their violence, often at the detriment of others. And that may be a generational gap that developers felt, much like Snake. The games they've been making do have their own complicated history with violence, but ultimately condemn it generally speaking, and so for the industry to shift so aggressively against them possibly created some polarity between how they felt and how old Snake feels in MGS4, exhausted and looking to get out. This is an interesting tension that simmers away throughout the game to mixed results, but the way it's introduced is certainly compelling. It's also introduced by the only new character in the game so far. Drebin occupies a unique space. He likens himself to the player by professing his neutrality, yet he's still using the war economy for his own gain. He's an incredibly cynical representation of what the system has allowed for, cravenly using it for self-gain while trying to offload or avoid any personal risk. He's also constantly sipping on a soft drink literally called Narc. This doesn't just make you wonder if he's as independent as he claims, but presents him as an object of pure consumption. He has no qualms about using the degenerated social and material conditions of the time to selfishly profit. A hustle mindset loser adapted to war times. But while this is all intriguing, he's ultimately kinda shallow. I suppose that's part of the point, but I'm left wanting him to wrap things up, which isn't a good sign for a guy who travels with a monkey wearing nappies and trying to bum durries constantly. I should be entertained by him, but I'm just not. What's more egregious in the immediate is that Snake allows Drebin to inject him with nanomachines almost without any discussion. Trusting random people to inject you with shit is a large part of what got you in this mess in the first place, Snake. In a game so invested in Snake's character, this is a patently absurd choice, completely in conflict with what we know about him. And thematically, there's really no good motivation for it. Is this meant to make us think he's an idiot? Because that's really all it's doing. Guns of the Patriots is not about deception and control in the same way MGS1 is, so this decision is so baffling. But hopefully doesn't mark a trend for frustrating story and plotting decisions going forward, right? Rat Patrol are kinda a mixed bag. The crew's composed of Meryl, Johnny, and two guys whose names I won't say because I can't remember them. Not that you need to remember them, they're transparently pointless and devoid of any actual character, existing more to fill out space in cutscenes. The stuff between Meryl and Snake is really effective. They have a sort of chemistry, but one muddled by sordid details and things they might rather forget. Meryl has changed in that she's more competent as a soldier, but is still hot-headed and a bit stubborn. And then on the other side, Snake continues to talk down to her a little, assuming a place of authority he really has no right to. Bringing Meryl back could easily be a cheap way to win nostalgic players over, but it's instead used to show how messy and unfulfilled these last 10 years have felt for these people, in turn reflecting what this world has done to them. They also get into the nitty-gritty of the ID system and what it tracks, tapping into the intensely data-driven society that we now live in, where you try and guarantee market success by first stealing all the information of the people you want to sell to, in the hopes of hyper-targeting them with advertising. Although interesting to think about, you then have Johnny and the two nobodies. The others are so inconsequential that I won't bother dwelling, but man, fucking Johnny? As a refresher, this is the guy who Meryl steals a uniform off in MGS1, who we then find out is plagued with diarrhea when he's guarding Snake post-torture. Then in MGS2, you hear him struggling with his stomach again. These appearances are puerile and juvenile for sure, but are mostly tertiary details. They're not overlong and exist as little jokes. But in MGS4, Johnny's been elevated to the main cast and exists as one big, drawn-out, unfunny joke. It's such an obviously bad impulse to promote this guy and make him matter to the plot, that it almost makes me wonder if perhaps Kojima is actually a big fucking idiot. He just makes each scene with these guys markedly harder to get through, and in the process undercuts the greater autonomy Meryl's been afforded by the script. Johnny's also the reason Rat Patrol is spotted, with some of Liquid's personal frog troops being sent into the building to take you out. So not only does he weigh the plot down, but he's become responsible for a truly grueling encounter that highlights one of the worst aspects of Guns of the Patriots' gameplay. MGS4 likes to pretend it's a competent third-person shooter now and then, when unfortunately it's not. A concerted effort has been made to make the act of shooting simpler and more natural. You don't have to use like 8 buttons just to take someone out in first person like MGS3, and the greater movement options and light cover system make it so you don't feel unequipped mechanically to deal with these enemies. But at the same time, the shooting's never really good. It's passable, but bland and pretty out of place. These sections tend to feel less like a shooter and more like a shooting gallery. There's always been moments of practically mandatory combat in the series, and navigating these sequences non-lethally tends to limit your options. But in MGS4, straight-out gunfights are relatively common. If you're trying to, play stealthily and not kill people, Your gameplay is regularly hamstrung and just not accounted for, which, to be fair, is an avenue through which the game expresses its ideas. In a world so surveilled and ultimately dominated by war, the only way to make some sort of mark seems to be to commit violence. Before, combat was made sluggish because it wanted you to be avoidant. It was a way to communicate anti-war ideas under the context of a video game with guns in it. But now the world has been so smoothed out, flattened by tanks and the war machine generally, that violence is easy, it's actively encouraged. So when you try and avoid lethality, friction emerges between the player and the game. It's a friction that should make you question why it's there in the first place, but by actively designing encounters like the ones against the frogs, you become too distracted by the fact that you're not having fun to actually engage with the text in that way. Or maybe you do manage to engage, but find that the experience doesn't improve with that understanding. Taking out the frogs non-lethally isn't like a challenge, it's just a more annoying way to play the game. So understanding what's being said thematically here does not subvert or recontextualize your actions in any meaningful way. This encounter, and all others like it, are made worse by their contrast to another lane of gameplay in MGS4, which succeeds thematically and mechanically. When the war zones aren't so hectic, it becomes easier to discern the differing sides of the conflict and by extension really embody that theme of sense through gameplay. By aiding one side on the battlefield, you earn their trust, not having to worry about them shooting at you. The ID system comes to life through gameplay, where you recognize how fickle and vague these conflicts are. These PMC soldiers have no connection to this war, and so are defining allies and enemies simply through who they see shooting the other guys. This naivete becomes something you can materially benefit from, adding a dimension of morality to your actions and the violence they do or do not entail. These stealth spaces being dominated by an established conflict also adds an interesting dynamic to sneaking. Most NPCs tend to be preoccupied, and so you're less concerned by predictable routes of walking, instead having to react more, which is reminiscent of how I talked about the first true gameplay area. MGS4 successfully captures satisfying gameplay experiences via quiet, full-on stealth, and these more active combat environments with the same type of level design. There's an impressive consistency in approach that lends cohesion to rather disparate stealth experiences. On top of being able to choose a side, you also get Drebin points for any excess guns you pick up off the ground, which are used to purchase or unlock weapons and ammo. This encourages violence, but also creates an odd voyeuristic impulse. It's strategically prudent for you to wait around in an area so that more soldiers die, so that you can then profit off of it, or to crawl over bodies on your way to the objective. You can act as a spectator to war, cynically benefiting from your engagement with it in a pretty grim way. These systems are important, but not terribly intrusive, ultimately adding up to a holistic impression that the way war's been prolonged and spread across the earth is turning you into someone worse. The brief moments when you can seemingly effect positive change, saving prisoners or taking people out non-lethally, then become rewarding in a way removed from mechanics. It's a direct implication of narrative into your actions as a player. Playing Guns of the Patriots can be really thoughtful and engaging and fun, but also tedious, ill-conceived, and irritating just as much of the time. Part of what's so fascinating about how the game turns a war into a suite of mechanics ties into presentation. Although we're never given enough details to make any judgment about if there's a more sympathetic side here, we do sneak in disguised as our assumed image of what a terrorist is. The game, structurally, evokes the war on terror and then puts you on the side of who, based on aesthetics, we'd assume the bad guys are, given the semiotics of the time. This choice is really inspired and brings over ideas from MGS2 to reflect our world within the game. The US was able to use 9/11 to manufacture an association in people's minds. They leveraged tragedy and nascent patriotism to try and convince US citizens that everyone in the Middle East looked like this, and that conveniently, so did the terrorists. It allowed mass dehumanization and in turn hyper-normalization of violence. As someone born in '98, the war on terror was an image present throughout my entire childhood. Yet as a kid, I don't think I'd ever conceived that a building in the Middle East could ever not be crumbling and bombed out. And what MGS4 chooses to do, not long after the US's surge to fix the problem with more troops, is dump you amongst the crumbling towns, running alongside men in, by 2008 standards, stereotypical terrorist garb, fighting people who resemble a more modern United States-style military, as they're the ones who occupy the bombed-out buildings, defending nothing but the land itself, of which they have no legitimate ties to. The absurdity, cruelty, and illegitimacy of the war on terror is being highlighted here, and as you take this in, the game's mechanics challenge you not to engage, while giving you the option to expressly benefit from engagement, having dropped in as some removed third party. This whole act is rife with contradictions, which, while messy, are really interesting to marinate in as you play the game. Soon enough, you make it to where Liquid is. As Snake closes in on him, Liquid's able to, as we learn soon after, inhibit the nanomachines that everyone's been injected with as part of the Sons of the Patriots, or SOP, ID system. As if feeling the weight of their PMC career all at once, they lose it, foaming at the mouth, writhing around and fighting each other. Even Snake suffers to an extent, presumably due to what Drebin injected him with. Fortunately, he is helped out by a hooded Naomi and later Johnny. It's a really great introduction to this now fully merged Liquid Ocelot. You'd expect them to be very talkative, but instead it's an almost 10-minute scene with barely any dialogue. Liquid, previously so obsessed with his own position in relation to Snake, addresses him rather casually. He has complete control and has become so untethered that he doesn't need to say anything, it all speaks for itself. It's an unnerving way to threaten to give people what they want, while refusing to actually do it. I've mentioned this tension that crops up occasionally, of being conflicted over whether to just give fans what they want or to continue pushing the envelope. And while this encounter with Liquid manages to balance out these impulses, giving us something familiar in a new way so as to reorient characterization and motive, the game rarely hits that balance. MGS4 is constantly reminding you of the old games, MGS1 especially, in ways that are clumsy and ill-advised. We've covered Johnny already, but there's also the prompts to get literal flashbacks as characters are introduced and so on. I understand the logistical purpose this serves, as many people will be playing MGS4 not having played 1 since 1998, but it comes off as so desperate. It feels like a cheap attempt at activating some synapse in your brain to recognize the old, comfortable thing. There's also the Beauty and the Beast unit, which you're introduced to shortly before confronting Liquid. I'll wait until later to get into too much detail, but they're modelled off of MGS1 bosses and come across as a cheap attempt to win players over. These regular reminders of games that were able to stand on their own while remaining in step as part of a franchise contribute to the impression I have of Drebin, which is that Guns of the Patriots just doesn't quite have the juice. It's burdened by obligation and at a loss for good ideas. As much as I find the setting for MGS4 intriguing, it's literal to a fault, being way too committed to MGS2's surreal elements, now trying to follow up on them with a more grounded narrative and visual identity, which in itself creates a new problem. The plots of Metal Gear games are generally contextualized by secrecy. The idea was that people not directly involved weren't going to find out about these stories because they get covered up and brushed under the rug. But MGS4's world is largely defined by the open normalization of what was previously left hidden. As such, it becomes hard to believe that normal people are just out there living normal lives. And so as a consequence, the entire world has been heightened rather than just the world of espionage and conspiracy as in other games. Suddenly, Liquid Ocelot is a guy who'd be on the news because of the stuff he's doing. And I'm to believe that people are sitting down at their TV and just accepting that this former US agent took on the mind of a terrorist because he got the terrorist arm grafted onto his stump? And at that point, how can there be any real stakes here? Why would I care if Liquid takes over the globe? This is a cartoon now, and everyone involved in this story is so dependent on the established canon that to take it away and create normalcy through victory would almost seem worse than just letting Liquid do his thing. Of course I like Snake, I'm invested in him experiencing catharsis and finally being able to rest. But why invoke the threat of world domination if it's impossible to believe there's a real world to actually dominate? Previous games found power in the odd juxtaposition they captured. The strange, fantastical, and heightened in-game characters and events were informed by concepts, settings, and stories analogous to, or directly ripped from, the player's own society. These competing tones work together to create something really unique. But Guns of the Patriots has forgotten that. It's so entrenched in its own lore and history that its massive finale feels fundamentally broken. It functions at times, like this scene with Liquid where the character drama and history makes for something really engaging, but these moments of success act merely as distractions from the prevailing lack of stakes needed to tie it all together and make it actually function as an overarching narrative. In the briefing, the yolks of Sonny's eggs break, representing the failure of Snake to take Liquid out. Despite admonishing him for smoking earlier, she also offers Snake a dart with his eggs. I quite like these three being the core team. The support units of other games have been whittled down by a stratified society, each engaged in their own war in a way. Watching Otacon and Snake fail at being dads is entertaining, but resonates with something a bit deeper. The game harbours an obvious anxiety about the future and whether there'll be one at all. And these two guys floundering with Sonny helps personalise that notion. She's part of a new generation, but Snake and Otacon aren't able to properly prepare her for what's to come. This anxiety may also mirror the development team a little, and that impression of their industry moving on that I brought up earlier. For Kojima specifically, the fear may be that he won't be able to pass this thing on to those that come after him, as people insist he keep a hold of it. Despite my misgivings with some of the storytelling so far, I think Guns of the Patriots really captures a sense of paranoia, and paranoia is an interesting emotion to drill down into. The War on Terror was sort of the new frontier for the American Empire after the Cold War, and this time, despite how the government tried to spin it, it wasn't so much an American project. It was a project exclusively in service of capital, and while that machine spun up, the internet came into its own, making for an endless state of surveillance and narrative control. The paranoia that MGS4 exudes tonally feels very familiar to me as someone who's grown up alongside the internet and the War on Terror. I have an overwhelming sense that everything I'm shown is on some level an attempt at coercion, whether it's trying to get me to buy some clothes or convince me that Palestinian children deserve to die. This is the benefit of literalizing the path the world was on at the end of MGS2. It hurts the story in many ways, but also allows it to reflect a unique modern state of mind. The crew get a call from Campbell, who repeats a bunch of stuff Otacon has already said, and then Otacon repeats some stuff he's just said as well. Anyway, Naomi's in South America, captured by Liquid to study the SOP nanomachine so that he can control the system for his own use. So that's the next destination. You're sneaking into South America as a UN inspector, in a way pointing towards the US's history as a force of regime change and coups across South America, at times using organizations like the UN or NATO as vectors through which to manufacture consent in favor of their imperial efforts in these instances. Gameplay reflects this somewhat. You start out getting an actual look at the resistance that PMCs are being sent in to either aid or quell. There's a sense of legitimate resistance, and although the opportunism of the war economy still prevails, it's significant that Metal Gear harkens back to its own past gameplay-wise as an earlier era of history is recalled thematically. If you manage to free captured rebels, they'll fight alongside you. You're never relieved from culpability in the system. Even your assistance to helpless people lets you benefit both from their willingness to fight and the paternalistic relationship that inevitably develops from the dynamic, wielding power over those you've assisted even if you don't want it. This section in South America cleverly weaves from pure stealth to live-fire stealth and back again as you progress, flexing all the gameplay muscles it has at its disposal, which means you'll likely become more aware of the stress meter and sight gauge. When you're stressed enough, the sight gauge will drain, having adverse effects on your controls as well as slowing health regeneration. Snake's hands will start to shake, and I believe when it's bad enough random inputs will happen, meaning that a weapon might get unequipped or Snake might crouch and so on. The sight gauge attempts to capture some of the same tension as the stamina bar from Snake Eater while softening its impact, similar to what's been done to camouflage. Ultimately, it doesn't come together. On a fundamental level, it just doesn't penetrate enough of the experience to meaningfully contribute to it. It's a tiny layer on top of gameplay that can largely be ignored. The game tries to insert it by having the sight gauge drain in cutscenes that distress Snake, but this is a really lame implementation. It adds artifice to the whole concept and more just reminds you that the sight gauge is a thing because it's largely forgettable. Another issue is that the effects of high-stress situations are easily foregone because of how many items you find that reduce stress. There's no thought being put into the system by the player, it's purely a nuisance. MGS4's economies at large have this issue. Between the abundance of items and large amount of Dragon points you're always collecting, you're never left wanting for anything. The metaphor, if you can even call it that, these ideas are so minimally abstracted that the label of metaphor feels very generous. Anyway, the metaphor barely functions because the rules of supply, demand, and private ownership and control of capital central to capitalism are so lightly felt by the player that there's no friction to gameplay that stokes introspection or consideration of the intricacies of a military-industrial complex. You do clock that the money you get from grabbing items off dead bodies allows you to buy more weapons. That much tracks, but it never gets any deeper than that. There's no alternative means that would make you actually alter your interaction with the world so as to abstain from this system, and the whole thing is so streamlined that your complicity within it fades to the background rather quickly. The effect is quite shallow. Which could be part of the point, I suppose. War has been made so easy that people have little trouble in reconciling their complicity in it, including someone as storied as Snake. But this just doesn't really come across, because you also find plenty of ammo, healing items, and distraction tools as normal pickups around the maps. So there's this additional item economy not tapped into SOP in the same way that also makes the game really easy by way of abundance. Guns of the Patriots is afraid of challenging you through game difficulty, and as such the system's built to challenge you narratively by way of gameplay fall flat as well. Right after entering South America you see Vamp attempting to track Snake down. Even amongst the game very concerned with reminding you of previous entries in the series, Vamp sticks out. He really didn't contribute to the actual plotting of Metal Gear Solid 2, he mostly gets lied to and used, so why would he join up with Liquid? Now in hearing that, you may mistake it for genuine curiosity, which would imply further investment in seeing what happens, but that's not the case at all. Vamp is fun in Sons of the Patriots, but not like an amazing character, and as I said, not consequential enough that finding out his current loyalties promises to advance the plot or themes in a meaningful way. He immediately reads as a narrative dead end, and that assumption is barely proven wrong. Campbell also gives you a call and introduces you to a member of the mission and his new wife. Rose. The much younger woman Meryl referenced him seeing earlier was in fact Rose, with them getting together after Raiden disappeared not long after the Big Shell incident. This is a big telling what's happening on your screen to fuck off sort of moment. It feels like an incredibly lazy way to try and tie characters and the series' history together, and is on its face really creepy for obvious reasons. It does reaffirm my dislike of the Colonel, considering he spends most of the series being a disloyal prick or certified creep, and does add an odd uncanny element to the act. These two become the Codex support team, which mirrors Raiden's situation in MGS2, conjuring up the psychological torment of his journey, right as he emerges into the plot of MGS4. You get some sparse, brief calls from Raiden. In my MGS2 video, I point out how the mantle of Grey Fox gets passed down first to Olga and then Raiden himself, represented by the sword. He becomes the person most tortured by the narrative, and more specifically, the secretive cruelty of the Patriots. True to that progression, Raiden in his first calling onto the Patriots is analogous to Deep Throat, warning you of danger ahead and remaining rather anonymous. It's symbolic shorthand to get us up to speed with where Raiden is mentally. In his next call, he divulges his current mission, to retrieve the remains of Big Boss for someone called Big Mama. Though I'm not sure what's left after we've fried Big Boss in Metal Gear 2. Although some of the plot elements of Act 2 we've covered so far are intriguing, they feel sort of disparate and shallow despite how they share the connective tissue of Sons of the Patriots. Most of it leaves me frustrated by a pure lack of originality, and things don't improve on that front as you near your objective. You find Naomi hidden away in a house, alone. She relays just how all-encompassing the SOP system is. She also explains why Snake is aging prematurely. He was designed to have a short lifespan, a move of insurance by Foxhound, and a way to imbue the narrative with tension. Snake is so central to Metal Gear that it's hard to conceive of it if some version of him isn't at the center, and so focusing on his mortality almost becomes meta-textual, an acknowledgement that the series isn't long for the world, perhaps building off the anxiety around the video game industry and its embrace of violence I mentioned when we met Drebin. As Snake's body changes due to aging, Foxdie continues to mutate, and within 3 months its degraded receptors will stop it from being able to distinguish its predetermined targets, essentially turning Snake into a vector for Foxdie to spread as an airborne virus. The most surefire way to stop the spread would be for Snake to die. What Naomi tells us is of consequence to the plot, but doesn't particularly illuminate the game's themes beyond what we already know. Naomi as a character doesn't help matters. Although I found the sexually charged banter from MGS1 exhausting and regressive, it was at least sort of fun, and in that game she has clear motives and develops really interestingly, delivering some of the best drama in the series, but here she's robbed of all that. She's heavily involved with Liquid but also doesn't want to be, and as far as I can tell has no ambitions or goals beyond what she's doing with Liquid, and so she barely feels like a person. It's like she's literally not done anything or changed at all from the end of MGS1. Additionally, she's been redesigned to always be showing her cleavage, with the camera sort of lingering on her chest. Naomi's most distinguishable characteristic in this game is her body, which is not only unjustified within the limits of the plot, but when combined with her total lack of personality becomes unfortunately objectifying. The trifecta of Eva, Paramedic, and the boss in Snake Eater showed distinct progress being made in how the series portrayed women, but it's all undone here in Guns of the Patriots. There's the way Meryl is undermined by Johnny, the continued odd sexualizing of Mei Ling, Naomi's simplicity and objectification, and finally the Beauty and the Beast unit. You have your first true encounter with them after Naomi's snatched from the house, facing off against Laughing Octopus. As a boss fight I actually kinda like it. It blends stealth skills, primarily situational awareness and general observation, with outright action in a fun way, and one that doesn't betray the promise of a purportedly stealth-forward experience like MGS4. But then there's her, and by extension the rest of the unit as actual characters. Even more so than Naomi, these are not people. Under their suits they have human-like faces, and after each encounter Drebin will monologue about their respective backstories and trauma. These attempts at humanization are hollow and a complete failure. Each one exists as an amalgam of previous villains. They're based off MGS1 bosses, use guns from MGS2 bosses, and are centered around an emotion like MGS3 bosses. So already they're wrapped up in the game's general desperation to create finality and a recursive sense of identity to the series by cheaply reminding you of other things from it. They're robbed of originality and as such, identity. They then primarily present completely covered up and inhuman, briefly shedding their suits once the bulk of their health is whittled down. This could present a chance to put a face to a name, but all Guns of the Patriots cares about is how pretty that face is. They wear skin-tight suits, have these uncanny too perfect faces, and are framed by the camera in a way that accentuates their bodies. They're completely depersonalized. And then worst of all, they don't even get to be the ones to tell their stories. As I said, Drebin, a man, gets that honor. It's ridiculous how many of the basic, easily avoidable traps the game falls into when it comes to writing women poorly. It cares way more about making things the player wants to fuck than actual characters, in the process bastardizing its own intra-series history to do it. Which really represents how MGS4 treats women broadly. It's not mean-spirited, but so immensely ignorant that it's frankly embarrassing. Watching Meryl get undermined is frustrating, sitting through Naomi's exposition is dull, and the Beauty and the Beast unit are unbearable, typifying Guns of the Patriots as absolute worst impulses and ideas. Once Laughing Octopus is taken care of, you track Naomi down to a heliport where she's being escorted by Vamp. Drebin's able to come in and help you grab her, leading to a dull turret section. Soon enough, Naomi and Snake make it to a helicopter to be airlifted out by Otacon, while Raiden stays behind to take care of some Gecko and Vamp. In MGS2, Raiden is used as a way to confront the player, to make them realize that although they want to be the hypermasculine, gruff Solid Snake, they're actually the new guy who's been taught to shoot via video games. But now that we're post-Sons of Liberty, Raiden gets treated like Solid Snake. He calls Snake to give him advice, and starts his fight with the Gecko by discarding a cowl/coat like Snake at the start of MGS2, and then ending with that dramatic, scented, explosive pose like when Snake lands on the tanker. In a way, that one version of the S3 plan worked, successfully creating another Snake, though with a different bent now that he wields the sword. This is a neat development, but not one with tons to dig into. Raiden's been exaggerated a lot with his hyper-stylized combat and new design. He's less of an actual person and not given much screen time with which to disprove that assertion. Perhaps that's just meant to represent his will or sense though. Most other people in the story have at least semi-cogent wants and ambitions, even if they're simple. You can see how they pursue their sense and how it manifests in a hyper-militarized world. Yet Raiden, having been completely depersonalized in MGS2, has no real will because he has no sense of self. He's been shaped in the image of Snake and Grey Fox and Olga, barely a person of his own. His encounter with the Gecko is stylish for sure, but not a smart way to fight. These are the tactics of someone with little self-preservation but immense ability. His propensity to successfully commit violence is who he is, and in the process he's deadened everything inside of him, represented externally by his cybernetic design. And cunty heals. He finds his mirror in Vamp, who without fortune has also become numb, and thanks to his ability to rapidly heal wounds is without a will, as his ambitions aren't contextualized by mortality. Their fight is theatrical but also cathartic, a way for whoever comes out on top to prove themselves the superior of the Big Shell incident survivors. That victor ends up being Raiden, who manages to escape to the helicopter, nearing death from his wounds. Now, a lot gets said about MGS4's want to use nanomachines to explain everything away, to the point where you can kind of forget just how much of a crutch it is. And then Naomi will explain that her nanomachine design is the reason Vamp can heal like that, and it hits you how absurd it is that immortality has practically been achieved, and yet it's just never addressed any further. If this technology exists, does like any illness at all still exist? Wouldn't this be something PMC CEOs or government leaders would be interested in? You would think that surely something this monumental would be central to such a corrupt culture. But nope. As mentioned, the Guns of the Patriots is so obsessed with its own continuity that it cheapens it again and again because it can't be bothered to actually come up with any worthwhile connections. Sorry, I didn't intend to bring this up, but I was rewatching the footage while writing and it really hit me how fucking dumb this is. And not in the fun way that Metal Gear usually is dumb, because this time it's trying to drag the good games down with it.
Snake, Raiden. Europe.
The Act 3 briefing begins by attempting to give Naomi more depth, as she connects with Sunny by helping with her eggs and bonding over their shared interests. There are two frayed threads in relation to Sunny as a character that Guns of the Patriots attempts to have Naomi weave together. These are her not knowing Olga, and her having to grow up removed from the normal world, struggling to derive a sense of identity from her surroundings. This is the angle the game takes.
Us girls have to look our best.
This line is predicated not just on all the other women in the story having been done a disservice, but Naomi specifically being more sexualized and muted than previously. By Act 3, I was past the point of charitability in regards to this subject, so to see this be the way Sunny's disparate needs are connected was enough for me to be kinda mad at MGS4. Things don't improve much as the game then attempts to manufacture a relationship between Naomi and Otacon, while the next steps of the mission are sussed out. They have no chemistry, and so it's not any fun to watch unfurl, and although the game tries to tie it into the tension around Naomi's unclear motivations, By now it seems pointless trying to care. It just hasn't successfully made me interested in her, and the plot is so picky as to what it decides is and isn't important that any speculation or theorizing on the player's part is useless. For all I know, Naomi's a fucking clone purely made out of nanomachines. I wouldn't put that kind of shit past Guns of the Patriots. This type of thing, the forced relationship, is so frustrating because it just clearly doesn't function. It's honestly insulting that the game is doing this and acting like I'll buy into it, and makes me resent large portions of the narrative. Not that I need a Metal Gear game to make perfect sense, but in MGS4 the nonsense plotting and character moments feel in service of affirming the player and their investment into the series, rather than actually exploring interesting themes. Liquid has now discovered that in order to properly control SOP, he'll need the exact DNA of Big Boss, as himself and Solid aren't actually an exact match for the old man. So you have to make contact with Big Mama's resistance group in Europe to try and retrieve Big Boss's still alive body before Liquid does. It pisses me off that this series refuses to let Big Boss die, and pisses me off more that I'm getting pissed off over this sort of thing. Generally speaking, I really don't care what happens in a story. I don't concern myself with plot holes or continuity or anything like that too much. I'm always way more driven by what a piece of art is about, what I think it's saying. But because MGS4 is so consistent on creating a world in the most literal image of the other games, it has highlighted concerns of continuity and plot beats of its own accord. Guns of the Patriots, on one hand, really cares about its own history and lineage, but then on the other is completely fine butchering it all in execution. Big Boss by this point is very much a symbol. His ideas have been interpreted by so many other characters that his history is permanently tampered with. His ascension to a central symbiotic is fascinating and very much in step with a series of sentiments and interests. So him being alive doesn't even really matter, right? We understand that he represents much more now, and so his continued presence is a vector through which to channel these concepts. Which should be exciting, but MGS4 seems to think the fact that he's a guy who's breathing and who isn't an exact genetic match for Liquid and Solid is a much more important avenue of focus. So in trying to look at the game on its own terms, I'm left getting annoyed by dumb CinemaSins type shit when I could be doing actual analysis. I said at the beginning that this is the first Metal Gear game built on the promise to answer rather than ask, and by Act 3 it had fully settled in that this was a fundamental mistake. The effects of this bare-faced, globe-spanning military-industrial complex has augmented as proximity changes. As the central location of the War on Terror, the Middle East is shown as an out-and-out battlefield, with live battles happening almost at all times. Somewhat removed, we have South America, which while still rife with conflict, remains in actual stealth for longer periods of time. And now we're in Eastern Europe, in a city never named, but based on Prague. It gets used as a general representation of the Cold War, and the very fact that it never became a hot war, with gameplay matching that fact in turn. Rather than weave through warring PMCs, you don a camouflage of a younger looking Snake and trail agents through quiet city streets. As a style of gameplay it's not particularly in-depth, it more just presents a new context under which to apply your stealth skills, but I think that's for the best. Metal Gear can tend to veer into new gameplay motifs or mechanics that are so underutilized that you can barely get accustomed to them before they fade away from the experience. Like the rope descending in MGS1 for example. Here though, the idea gets room to realistically evolve and complicate. It also shows will or sense in a new light. In Act 1 and 2, the locations and conflicts within them were seen as superfluous, so as a player you had freedom to participate in violence as you saw fit. But in Act 3 you're within the Imperial core, and so while violence doesn't flourish in the same way, surveillance certainly does. You're somewhat ironically less free here, because the system broadly thinks it's worth keeping this place standing, rather than letting it crumble under endless siege. Gameplay has become more restricted as a result. As you progress and engage with guards while still trying to avoid detection, a really fun tenor of stealth gameplay emerges. But why has the game chosen to make Snake's disguise for this act merely a younger version of himself? Surely the further from him the better, right? Well, this is the act where a mirror is more successfully held up to the series. Beryl expresses her frustration with Snake participating in this incredibly dangerous mission, resenting what he's become in a way that could be somewhat metatextual. And now Big Boss has re-emerged as a determinate factor, with narrative elements later on referencing previous games. So in that way, Snake's young face is a shortcut to instigate player retrospection about the series, and Snake's development specifically, as he's tried and failed to both fix the world and step away from the battlefield for his own sake. Naturally, sense is implicated in this. At the same time, as Guns of the Patriots progresses, it's tough not to become somewhat cynical about a choice like this. Is Snake young again just because that's an easy way to score points with players? Because plenty of stuff in MGS4 certainly feels that way. As I thought about this while playing, there emerged an apparent polarity between MGS2 and 4. Metal Gear Solid 2 is postmodern in the classical sense. It wants you to question its own existence and specifically its status as a sequel, so as to explore interesting ideas around dynamics of interaction, how people relate to fiction, and what it means to be a sequel in the first place. Sons of the Patriots actively gain something by being reflective. Metal Gear Solid 4 can often feel postmodern in the way that, like, Fortnite is postmodern. Fortnite is not a postmodern piece of art because it asks us to think about the art form of video games, but because it constantly makes us aware of its own artificiality through an endless cycle of corporate partnerships, wantingly blending disparate characters and pieces of culture. This postmodernism is shallow, unapologetic, indulgent, and unabashedly constructed around player consumption, and about deriving identification, or in some cases superiority, through that consumption. This doesn't make it worth dismissing outright. As a fulcrum point of live service game design and consumption politics, Fortnite serves as a worthwhile subject of discussion. But this discussion is not the point of the game's own thematic ambitions. It does not, in my eyes, make it good or thoughtful art by happening to be these things. So to get back around to my point, Guns of the Patriots can feel much the same. The Beauty and the Beast unit are so unsubtle in both their referential palette and relevance to the game's themes that they become practically pointless. They don't actually add anything because what they say has already been said by previous games in the series, and so you're left with only the cynical parts, the parts that are postmodern in the same way Fortnite is. Despite finding some justification for young Snake being the disguise in Act 3, it gets tough not to dismiss these types of choices because of how this game's postmodernism so often presents itself as mindlessly indulgent. For a series which also contains Metal Gear Solid 2, Guns of the Patriots can so often appear inauthentic, more like it's doing what it thinks you want rather than what it wants, and that's not a good look. It makes me want to disengage, because I'm not here for wish fulfillment, and the fact that it seems to think I am makes me think that perhaps this series isn't what it once was. Snake reaches Big Mama, who we can now confirm is Eva, and who he finds out is his mother, as she carried the subjects of Laissez-Fontaine as a surrogate. So she's called Big Mama as a reference to Big Boss, and because she's his mom. Do you get it? Some theological elements also re-emerge from MGS3. In that game they were a way to demonstrate how Operation Snake Eater was the original sin that created Big Boss and thus the rest of the series, via the trio of Snake, Eva, and Ocelot, who uses Adamska as a fake name. In MGS4, Snake and Eva meet in a church with a painted ceiling that depicts light shining from presumably Jesus' hands. You see this as Eva explains that Major Zero created the Patriots. So now the church is being used as a monument to the series and its origin, specifically the gods of this world, the Patriots. We also learn that Eva was a member of the Patriots, and that Paramedic was a founding member, along with Sigint. Okay, shut that fucking thing up, we can't keep doing this. Which is part of the problem. All Eva does here is just detail the plot of MGS3 and then also the history of the Patriots, in the process causing them to lose some mysticism. I love how they manifest in MGS2, as this formless amalgam of ideas shaping culture and history. It's eerie and abstract in a really fun way. But I don't need to know that Paramedic was the person who undertook the cloning of Big Boss. It just feels like bringing back old characters for the sake of it. The most important details are that Major Zero and Big Boss split off not long after the cloning, and that the crux of the Patriots became to use Big Boss as a symbol to enact the organization's will around the globe, eventually morphing into 4 AIs as Zero's trust in others eroded, by this point having recovered Big Boss's charred body from Metal Gear 2 and keeping it barely alive. In case you don't get the significance of this already very obvious and heavy-handed monologue, the game shows framed key art of the previous games on the walls of the fucking church, as though it thinks the player is unable to actually exercise interpretation. Finally, we find out that Naomi's dipped from the Nomad, and Big Mama's group gets discovered, so it's time to try and escape with Big Boss's body. After a crash, you take Raging Raven out and get back to Eva, with the two of them heading down to the river, where the rest of the Resistance is escorting Big Boss's body. They were ambushed by Liquid, who now has the remains, as well as the reconstructed GW. He basically wants to level society and then become the founding member of the Patriots of the New World, which, considering how much we've been told over and over this world is fucked, I can see how a lunatic like Liquid Ocelot would see this as a good idea. The US government steps in to prevent Liquid's shenanigans, but with control of SOP, he's able to stop them in their tracks. Liquid commands SOP by doing finger guns at things, which at this point, fuck it, it's fun. Liquid fires at the boat Snake, Eva, and Rat Patrol are on, Snake and Eva suffering some burns, and 2 of the Rat Patrol guys die. I think, at least. I mean, who gives a shit? Meryl nearly dies, which should be emotional, but Johnny's the one who revives her, and at this point making him suddenly competent is more annoying than keeping him as the walking fart joke. Oh, and then they kiss. Good fucking god, this game. Eva eventually succumbs to her injuries in Snake's arms, Drebin swooping in to pick the survivors up. Also, what I just recapped over the last minute takes 27 minutes in-game to let you know how overwrought things are getting. That's about 10 minutes too long, and I'm being generous there. As Sunny cracks her eggs, much more proficiently this time, she lists off the names of stops along the Myokan train line in Japan. The line largely runs through the Hyogo prefecture, with the final few stops crossing over in the Osaka prefecture. As Kojima moved to Osaka when he was 4, it's possible he used this train line himself growing up. A reference back to a simpler yet nonetheless important time is appropriate, as the mission requires us to revisit Shadow Moses. The nukes and wrecks are some of the few not controlled by the Patriots under SOP, and so Liquid hopes to appropriate them, using them to take out the JDAI core, vaulting GW, the one core they have control over, into the leadership position, thereby giving them control of the other 2 remaining cores and the whole of SOP. The prospect of returning to Shadow Moses should fall into place as yet another piece of unneeded fanservice in the game, but it's so loaded with history and relevance that it escapes that label. The irony of the world passing not just Snake by, but the cutting-edge weapons technology he thwarted in the past is really compelling. It speaks to the complexity of even having nostalgia for a Metal Gear game. They're each so based on exploring new ideas that wanting to relive old ones feels against the spirit of them, thereby making the act redundant. It's a good culminating point for the hints of conflict from the developers that eke through here and there. The Act 4 briefing repeats itself quite egregiously, like at the beginning you hear Liquid say he's going to use Rex, and then the support crew explain why Liquid might use Rex, like twice, and then at the end confirm Liquid is in fact going to use Rex, all in the span of like 15 minutes. MGS4 tends to over-explain itself in briefing sessions, which ties into its structure. Each one starts with a briefing, followed by the meat of the act, and finally a boss fight with one of the B&B unit. It will then use the preceding briefing to recap previous plot beats. This implies that the game wants you to play an act, put the game down, and then play the next one sometime later. But this is a time commitment I don't think a lot of people can afford, and a cadence of play that's not at all intuitive. MGS3's structure is a holistic consideration that contextualizes the entire experience, making for something you can just play for an hour or so without having to be openly episodic the way Guns of the Patriots is. The implementation of acts isn't an inherently bad choice, in fact it actively helps the campaign location hop in a believable way, but it's also being used as an excuse for MGS4 to indulge itself in ultimately negative ways. This decision is also used to remove character moments from the codec and shove them all into the briefings. Historically, the codec is this fascinating mix of detailed information about weapons or animals or military history, mixed with unique character interactions that the player can engage with at their will. But now, Snake only interacts with his support team in the briefings. The narrative is already single-mindedly hinged around Snake and Liquid, and removing the guts of the codec only contributes to this. It's a hard sensation to pin down, but it makes the playing of MGS4 feel a little hollow, like it's been built purely in service of ending things and not really building anything new, because that was part of the fun of the codec, exploring new relationships in this unique way. You approach Shadow Moses on foot, avoiding Gecko through frosty, gale-force winds. There's great restraint being shown here, allowing you to passively enter Shadow Moses rather than wrenching control away for a cutscene. This approach fundamentally shapes your impression of the base. What struck me most was that it felt like I was there for the first time. Not in that it captured the experience of playing MGS1, but that the earlier rendering was just a video game, and this time it was for real. You're so familiar with how it looked back in 1998 that you suddenly appreciate just how much greater the fidelity is here in Guns of the Patriots. Details you'd never considered or intuited, or that were fuzzed out by the philosophers of CRT, are suddenly legible. The best is yet to come, which plays over the credits of MGS1, plays as you explore. The reality of this new iteration is contrasted by a song meant to evoke optimism for a future without these apocalyptic weapons, a future where people who are exploited by their country, like Snake, can recapture their humanity and dignity. What's reflected in the new details of Shadow Moses is that the future MGS1 implied at its ending never came to pass. Instead of indulging the player, this revisit finally sees MGS4 asking you a question rather than giving you an answer. It asks, why would you ever romanticize this? What you thought was more pure, somehow better, was just as ugly, and in order to follow on from this more pure expression, Metal Gear as a series had to punish Snake. That's the only way it can move forward. The series that the player loves then becomes unsustainable, which is fascinating. Sequelized art that goes on this long tends to overstay its welcome by one entry, ending or going into hibernation, not on a bad note necessarily, but usually just a limp one, as you see that the people making these things have maybe gone back to the well one too many times. And Guns of the Patriots does feel the same way, but the difference is that the developers seem quite aware of that very fact as they make it so, sort of saying to the player, look, this shit can't go on forever. If it does, it's going to get messy, repetitious, and exhausting, which is exactly what MGS4 is. On Shadow Moses, the early onset existential dread that Snake faces throughout the game finally coalesces with the text's own insecurities and dissatisfaction with itself in a truly resonant way. It's a standout sequence that, while still stuck in the past, is built to capture the anxieties that make nostalgia so appealing, so that then you can interrogate and question them. It's postmodernism with a purpose, in the same vein as MGS2 and unlike the rest of MGS4. The unique feeling Shadow Moses captures 10 years on sustains through to where you fought Grey Fox, then waning as you fight Crying Wolf. The encounter tries to launder emotional resonance from Sniper Wolf in MGS1, but it doesn't work, really just denigrating her rather than uplifting this fight. You eventually make it to the underground hangar where Rex has already been stripped of the railgun by Liquid, Vamp showing up to keep you occupied. Suicide Gecko drop in, giving Vamp a chance to break free from Snake injecting him with the nanomachine inhibitors, right as Raiden also enters the fray. He takes care of Vamp while you use the railgun from Crying Wolf to eliminate the Gecko. This is the point where it finally feels like the game's making good on its promise to wrap things up. Snake and Raiden are at last equalized here. The action plays out in split screen simultaneously, with Raiden saying the line,
Sorry to have kept you all waiting.
Kinda. Snake also takes on a simulacrum of Raiden's role at the end of Sons of the Patriots, where he was taking on a bunch of Metal Gear. Snake does a similar thing using a railgun, reminiscent of Fortune. In contrast, Raiden's fighting somewhat of a mirror of himself on top of Rex, just like Snake did in MGS1. Vamp, through murdering Emma, is also connected to Otacon. Finally, Raiden's able to actually kill Vamp, effectively ending the thing that's been able to physically haunt him since the Big Shell incident. These are all images and notions that have prevailed through these games being mixed and matched during a really effective set piece, culminating in a symbolically significant act that finally promises looming closure. Naomi similarly uses the inhibitors on herself so she can face her mortality, as nanomachines had been able to stop her cancer from progressing. On one hand, it ties nicely into the concept of MGS4 being the point where the buck stops, where things aren't passed on to the next generation for the sake of that generation. On the other hand, it's all really fucking dumb and hilarious that the game expects me to care about Naomi as a character and all this nanomachine minutiae. The one aspect that does truly resonate is that she dies in the exact same place as her brother, who was the catalyst for her involvement in the series in the first place. In order to catch up to Liquid and his Outer Haven warship, Snake and Raiden hop in Rex. It's an idea so obvious that to actually indulge it would seem a mistake, as it can't possibly live up to the raw concept, but as you sweep through Gecko against the time limit, those first powerful moments of this foray into Shadow Moses are conjured up. It's reckless in a way that makes sense, the move of someone desperate for any way to end this thing as it crumbles around him. Raiden appears not to make it out of the collapsing tunnel as Liquid leaps out of the water, piloting a Metal Gear Ray unit. At this point I'm all fucking in. That scream of was like music to my ears. MGS4 has officially gotten stupid in a way interesting and cool enough that I can actually enjoy. The game's finally admitting that all it really cares about are these two, or three including Ocelot, and their messy history, each a symbol of exercising will and trying to impose or preserve it, while at the same time facing encroaching mortality and an increasingly connected yet stratified world. Rex and Ray fighting is the perfect spectacle for representing the degeneration of not just the universe of Metal Gear, but the series itself and how unsustainable it is as a creative project. It truly is a spectacle fight, deriving the vast majority of its stakes from the circumstances rather than the threat of mechanical failure. Despite each machine's infamy as weapons of range, the encounter smartly makes things more about close combat, dodging and then countering Liquid's attacks, much like their fistfight in MGS1. It also leans into the animalistic aspect of each Metal Gear. You pin and stomp and rip and tear. All the while, the buildings around you fall to pieces at contact. Frankly, it's a thing of glory. With Ray taken care of, Liquid retreats as Outer Haven rises out of the ocean, with a fucking Mount Rushmore of Big Boss, Solid, Liquid, and Solidus just stuck on the damn side. Invoking this image initially reads as a move of self-importance, but in truth it really works. In real life, Mount Rushmore is an atrocity of colonial power, an eerie image of pure domination, of sullying natural native beauty just for the sake of it, a monstrous reminder of America's history, literally carved in stone. MGS4 is more just trying to say that these 4 characters have historical importance to this series and its world, but by couching it amongst so far the most indulgent section of the game, it appropriately asserts that only someone as patently evil and nuts as Liquid Ocelot could think a thing like Mount Rushmore is a good idea. Overall, this sequence is just a perfect penultimate climax, from the dramatic heights of the Metal Gear fight to Snake being so dwarfed by Liquid's seemingly inevitable victory, the choice of having Liquid kill Snake by physically hitting him with his big boat of ego compensation, only to cut back to Raiden and allow things to quiet a little so he can cut his own arm off to free himself, at the same time playfully acknowledging Sonny's assumed disapproval, thereby admitting that he does have some people who care about him. And then, as you look at Snake submit himself to death, Outer Haven just stops. Raiden is physically holding it back, and Snake, confronted by this kid he tried so hard to help at MGS2 now doing the same to him, snapbacks to himself, only for Raiden to finally get crushed as he yells out for Rose. Finally, Liquid heads back underwater as Otacon approaches in a chopper, ending Act 4. Guns of the Patriots as a whole is about endings, but it can't just be a game of endings. It needs to have an original set of events to stand on its own. And so by necessity, it often feels like it's stalling for time, just inventing reasons to go for long enough until it can start to end and truly pay off the 20-year history of the series. Now that we've arrived at that ending, things are getting really good. The whole climax of Act 4 is of course stupid, but in the correct way. The game's now free to push all the buttons it knows it can push, and it does so with such skill that when I see Raiden single-handedly, literally, hold back an entire warship, it's emotionally powerful. It transcends reality and becomes pure expression. The mission is to land on Outer Haven when it surfaces to use Rex's railgun on the orbiting satellite containing the JD AI core. Once on board and in GW's server room, a worm cluster will be transmitted to it to eliminate Liquid's control of SOP. The inside info comes from Naomi. Although I think ultimately done a disservice in this game, I like how ambiguous her loyalties end up being. MGS4 spends so much time elucidating Will, exposing each character's wants so that they can then meet in conflict. Naomi's instead wavers and changes with the times, defined by how out of place and time she feels without Frank around. Additionally, the worm cluster is a combination of Emma's, Naomi's, and Sonny's work, and is probably the only inassailable bit of positive writing women get in this game. I breathed a sigh of relief when Snake didn't pitch in with some gross one-liner. As Otacon explains this, we see Snake's degenerating health highlighted. You watch from a dull, rather plain angle to emphasize how unremarkable the image of Snake coughing and stumbling around for his injections has become. We also see him smoke his second last cigarette of the pack. He's engaging in an at this point compulsive and self-destructive habit, flirting with death as he faces this inevitability, an exact mirror to his career as a soldier. Part of what really works in MGS4 is its refusal to let people live in the power fantasy of Snake. MGS1 indulges that constantly, making the player believe they're also the suave, womanizing killer, and then MGS2 briefly gives it to you before taking it away. Since then, people have been wanting Solid Snake back, in part so they could embody him as a figure of hypermasculinity again. But Guns of the Patriots doesn't give us that, not even in the climactic stealth section of the game. It recalls that feeling by planting you back on a ship's deck like in Sons of the Patriots, but stays entrenched in MGS4's methodology of level and encounter design to keep that wish fulfillment out of your grasp. You're in a sustained caution phase the entire time, meaning that Snake's being actively hunted down, alluding to his encroaching death. The ship's also siloed off into corridors essentially, with the only way to get from one to another tending to be through crawling or climbing. There's focus put on Snake's body and its enfeeblement. You feel yourself trying to push the sticks harder, as if that will make his old body move faster. Despite the greater fluidity of movement present in MGS4, the rigid geometry and bare surfaces of Outer Haven are rather prescriptive. There's less opportunity to exert your will upon the surface, with the idea of being an outsider influencing an ongoing conflict having been removed entirely as the narrative hones its focus on Solid and Liquid. Unfortunately, because gameplay is so informed by misaligned in-game economies, some of the tension is stripped away, as you're not left wanting for resources at all. But all in all, for a game so enmeshed in cheap callbacks, MGS4 at least has the sense to be very deliberate about how stealth as an act is sent off. Not by indulging you, but by reminding you that that very indulgence isn't helpful. Fittingly, you open the airtight door by mashing and head below deck. The first thing you do is defend Meryl from some frogs as she was captured right after boarding. This is a mirror to MGS1 that isn't needed and actively undermines the modicum of agency she did actually have in this game, and unfortunately things will only get worse for her. Screaming Mantis then enters, puppeting Meryl, similar to Psycho Mantis' mind control in MGS1. Psycho Mantis is incredibly important specifically to MGS1, not just because of the role he plays in the story, but as a part of the game's legacy, as an example of themes of control being externalized and forced onto the player in a really memorable way. As one of the first true instances of hearing a boss's backstory as they die, something MGS4 completely butchers. Mantis is symbolic of what made MGS1 so successful, an intersection of fascinating thematic concepts, larger-than-life dramatics, and unique moments of gameplay. Guns of the Patriots knows this, because instead of just evoking him through Screaming Mantis, which is what's been done via the other B&B members, he literally lives on through her. You see an apparition of him behind her, you hear his voice, and Screaming Mantis refers to herself as Psycho being, quote, another her. And seeing as it knows this, I assumed MGS4 was treating this encounter with more weight than the others. So what's being said here? I thought maybe it was tapping into the insecurity and looming mortality of the series itself that the developers seem to hint towards here and there, something I've brought up a few times. Having Meryl, a relic of the first game, get literally puppeted around in the cutscene and then the fight itself could be an acknowledgement that the game is just taking advantage of the semiotics of old, stringing them back up in an attempt to recapture something special. Or maybe having Johnny stop Meryl this time around means he takes Snake's place in her heart in a way, the game thereby breaking away from the past to become its own, quote, new thing. And the idea of moving forward instead of just repeating the past has some relevance to the events and ideas of MGS4, so there's promise to that avenue of analysis. But then you look at this new thing and see that Mantis' powers don't work if the victim doesn't have nanomachines, which is so representative of how Guns of the Patriots fails. Because this new thing is uninventive, overly literal, continuity-minded, and devoid of personality. So to me, there's a sort of fork in the road over how Mantis gets used in MGS4 and the interpretation of that use. On the left is an idea with merit implemented in a weighty way that unfortunately arrives at a conclusion that harbours all of the game's bad traits. And on the right is a mindless partial recreation of old ideas for the satisfaction of the dumbest, most incurious type of player, reheated right at the end of the experience to make it feel more important than it is. And what's so frustrating about this fork in the road is that the two roads merge back into one so fucking quickly. Even the one which requires some thought, the one that asks you to ponder about mortality and the series' own end, doesn't land, and those thoughts aren't much fun to have anyway. This sensation is what makes MGS4 such a slog. The parts that are interesting read as just as shallow as the rest of it while you're actively playing. This is the least confident I've been in my overarching observation for a Metal Gear game, because it's tough to sort out what parts are good or just happen to be when viewed retrospectively. This is perhaps best represented by Psycho Mantis reappearing to recreate his controller and memory card shenanigans with little to no changes, a potentially fascinating concept fizzling out into self-indulgent retreading. The boss fight itself sort of works due to how odd it is, snagging one of her dolls and then using all projectiles to gain control, ragdolling her around to do damage. It's an interesting reclamation, as Snake's often the subject of these sudden jolts of supernatural elements in the series, rather than the one controlling them. In that way, I suppose Snake put Screaming Mantis and the B&B unit she represents to bed, ending these constant relivings of his past and putting him in a position to move on, whether that be in his life or impending death. Snake then moves on to destroy GW, while Meryl and Johnny fend off more soldiers. As they do this, they propose to each other. And apparently all Meryl's dreamed of since she was little was getting married. I said it was going to get fucking worse for her, I'll leave it at that. While Snake moves towards GW's core, Raiden stays behind to stop any of Liquid's soldiers getting through. The split screen effect, which was previously used to signal optimism for these characters, is now used to highlight degeneration, suffering, and desperation. Snake comes apart at the seams as he progresses, with the rest of the resistance becoming overwhelmed by the enemy. The vocals used are the same as those that play during act title screens, a way to evoke the entire journey so far. The limited interactability plays into the inevitability of the moment. You don't even question doing anything but moving forward. There's an odd sense of catharsis, that, like the end of Act 4, things are finally becoming as consequential as they seem they should be. In that way, Snake is living out his destiny, the one owed to him by the times, by memes, by genes. GW's chamber recalls the now familiar title screen, acting as a graveyard for the Patriots. Big Boss's one-time allies. The centerpiece of the room, GW itself, also resembles the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. There it represented oncoming change, but here in MGS4 that portent of change is stopped by Dave and Hal. GW is destroyed and with it Liquid's control and army. The remaining AIs also get erased, thanks to some work Sonny did on the virus, essentially destroying the Patriots' work, leaving only one more fight left. Snake gets moved up to the deck of Outer Haven while Otacon retrieves a medic and Liquid approaches. He says that he wanted to end SOP after all, in an attempt to achieve the freedom Big Boss and Solid sought with Outer Heaven and Sons of Liberty. There were definitely easier ways to do all of this, considering his plan had unlimited points of failure, but there's no point scrutinizing the logistics here, it's all made up bullshit that will only get worse under that scrutiny. Liquid Ocelot's more important now as a symbol, like Big Boss, as someone who means something in relation to Snake. The game frames their fistfight the same way. There are a lot of close-ups, emphasizing the touch and physical contact that's a natural consequence of fighting. In this way, Snake is grappling with his past, and more specifically the lack of foundational familial relationships that could have allowed him to be someone who resists the call of the battlefield. In a way, Liquid is his only family, and so even his intense hatred and inflicting of physical pain carries with it closeness and a modicum of affection. Conversely, Ocelot sees Big Boss in Snake. His pure devotion and psychosexual fascination with Big Boss emerges a couple times throughout the game via how he treats Snake, but it's obviously most prominent here. The other most common type of shot is a wide, one that emphasizes the singularity of this relationship and encounter. You can't see anyone else, and in the end, the summation of the entire game is this. Outer Haven ends up as a monument to a recreation of the end of MGS1, fighting on top of a massive weapon, shirtless. The codependency rises to a fever pitch as they match each other's moves exactly, then injecting each other with inhibitors so they can rise again. Finally in control, the boss fight transforms as it progresses, moving through the UIs, music, and camera angles from Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, and 4. The whole sequence is brutally long, but effectively so. There becomes an aspect of exhaustion and desperation as you play. With that exhaustion, reminders of previous games don't ring as hollow attempts at crowd-pleasing, but as temporal implications. This fight hasn't been going on for 10 minutes, it's been going on for 50 years within the game's world and for 20 years within ours. With Liquid Ocelot's final words, you don't feel victorious, just relieved that it's finally over.
You're pretty good.
You're pretty good. Pretty good.
Look amazing.
The epilogue is almost episodic, with its series of scenes that each focus on tying up loose plot threads. It begins with Meryl's wedding. It's so painfully saccharine and hokey that it comes across more like someone writing a parody of Metal Gear. There's some humour in it, I suppose, but it's impossible for me to have any sincere feelings about it. Next is Raiden, and his scene isn't much better. Rose brings a kid to the hospital where he's recovering. It turns out she didn't have a miscarriage, which is what she had told Raiden not long after the events of MGS2. And in fact, she was only pretending to be married to Campbell for protection. I mean, good God, come on, why was this their solution? It's written as if to absolve them, but it's a really fucked up thing to do to Raiden regardless. And what's gained by this revelation? Campbell and Rose have so little meat to their characters in MGS4 that there's no thematic benefit to this. It doesn't make you reappraise them or recontextualize their actions, it just makes them seem like bigger weirdos. Also, how do they even know each other? Rose only ever interacted with an AI of Campbell, and after a certain point was cut off from even that. There's some merit to all this in that it is a material reason for Raiden to actually continue living. Having a family is like a storytelling shortcut for getting someone who's otherwise so tortured to decide they'll stick around. But it's just that, a shortcut. It's functional, but not meaningful, and certainly not believable. This whole scene feels like it has all the sappiness and melodrama of Raiden and Rose's relationship from Sons of the Patriots crammed into 7 minutes as opposed to 8 hours. Worst of all is the kid wearing his little grey sailor's outfit because the game refuses to have any colour, and being named fucking Little John.
Scared of me, huh?
Snake approaches the boss's grave. The war has changed Mantra returns, this time signaling the end of Snake's era of his usefulness and place in the world. We see Snake examine the pistol in his hands, removing and reinserting the single bullet he needs. Earlier, I posited that this recurring image of Snake inspecting weapons perhaps ties into a generational gap the developers felt, of their general refusal to reward violence having been stamped out by the emergence of arcadey multiplayer shooter experiences. Similarly, Snake harbours a dissonance between who he is, his purpose, and the world as it exists. He pulls the trigger and the shot echoes out, birds evacuating, just like when you shoot the boss in Snake Eater. After more shenanigans at the airstrip wedding and some bait and switch credits, we cut back to Snake on his hands and knees, having been unable to kill himself. Big Boss is here. The body that got burned was actually Solidus's, and Big Boss, having been kept in stasis by JD, was awoken once the AIs were destroyed. Additionally, the location of Zero was revealed, so he's being dragged along too. MGS4 spends a lot of time trying to explain how all this definitely makes sense, but ultimately, as we've touched on, it's using Snake, Big Boss, and now Zero as symbols, central semiotics to represent different points in time and levels of institutional power or control. Gene, meme, and scene are each ideas that ultimately exist to exert control, and within the series that control invariably manifests as the stifling or misrepresentation of people's will. Big Boss monologues about how the theme of sense, or will, underlines the entire history of the series. This isn't a revelation or anything, it's just that Guns of the Patriots rambles so much that it has to catch you back up on thematic ideas every time it wants to add on to them. But here it sort of works. As you confront the omnipresence of will throughout the series and how consequential it's been, you see the fulcrum of it all, Zero. He's a vegetable, himself, like the Patriots, an abstraction of a person in that you can't spot any internality. He seems to suffer through existence just to do it. Throughout his life he's wielded innumerable power, constructed something that for decades completely ran society, and yet it got him nothing, no contentment, no ability to face his mortality. His body technically functions, but he has no true control over it. In his pursuit of achieving what he interpreted as the boss's will, he's completely lost his own. There's no use purely living for someone else. His most outward expression of existence is the final desperate gasps he takes after Big Boss turns off his life support. The old man then starts to succumb to the fox die he's picked up from Snake, stumbling over to the boss's grave as he monologues. Big Boss, beyond the symbolic meaning we've discussed thus far, has, since MGS3, taken on a different sort of position within the series. He's someone who we can sympathize with more due to playing out his backstory, and so when he talks to Snake of his regrets, praises Snake as a better soldier/person than him, and brings back that concept of Snake living for himself from MGS1, he does so with a newfound narrative authority. It's not just Big Boss saying these things, but the series as a whole and the creators of it. It feels complete and final in a satisfying way, one that smartly uses a sympathetic character to deliver it so that it accrues greater emotional weight. And the re-emergence of Fox Die, as convoluted and at times inscrutable as it is a summation of spreading something, or passing something on, a concept the entire series deals with. From genes to meme, to scene, to sense, to even the worm cluster Emma and then Naomi and Sunny work on. So it makes sense to bring that back, also a remnant of MGS1. This 30-minute talk Big Boss unleashes is basically in service of appropriating the Metal Gear series' ideas, then threading them together using parts of MGS1, the game most people began with. While it's emotionally effective and admirable considering how sprawling the topics it's trying to summarize are, it sort of falls apart for me under scrutiny. It fails in the same way that a very similar speech from MGS3 does, the one from the boss to Naked Snake before they fight. In her speech, the boss, despite her narrative authority, speaks quite broadly about the conflicting ideologies of the Cold War, in such a way that it feels like it exposes the writer's lack of complete structural understanding of the times. The boss's monologue, like the end of MGS1 and 2, veers off into, like I said in the video, a sort of naive teleological liberalism, this belief that things will inevitably improve because that's simply how history works. Ergo, the emergence of liberalism has been a good thing. So now we get Big Boss being glad that Snake gets to live in a new world, one without the Patriots in their control. But the Patriots didn't literally create modern society, they didn't usher in the reign of capital. They explicitly emerged from the American exceptionalism of the Cold War era, then adapting to the ascent of neoliberalism and with it the privatization of everything and more specifically for the series, the military, which naturally gives way to how they act in Guns of the Patriots as an arbiter of a series of PMCs who run the world. So what's the game saying here, that as long as Major Zero's dead and the Patriots don't exist, everything is peachy? Again, like I say in my MGS3 video, I'm not expecting the series to be as explicitly anti-capitalist as I am, but it's frustrating to see this naivete butt its head in once more. Granted, the recursiveness and re-emergence of evil and war broadly is mentioned a bunch of times in this game, but I don't get the impression that Big Boss is getting at that with what he says about the post-Patriots world. This gives the impression of an ending cobbled together to try and salvage how muddy MGS4 becomes thematically, as it tries and fails to make it feel in conversation with its predecessors through overly literal continuity and heavy-handed yet weightless callbacks. So even though that final shot is emotional, The emotionality is laundered through effective use of imagery and good performances. It's not coming from the text itself. Something that is legitimately resonant about this debriefing is how it relates to the strained familial relationship here and Kojima himself. Big Boss essentially enters as Snake's dad to tell him that everything's okay now, that he can go on living his life on his own terms. Metal Gear, having become Kojima's own battlefield over the last 20 years, can now, after MGS4, be put to rest. Perhaps Kojima now felt he'd accomplished something with the strength and creative resolve that came with his father's death and could move forward without guilt. Fittingly, we only ever see or hear Big Boss within the graveyard, suddenly reappearing only to die minutes later. It does feel like a spirit, something from beyond the grave, is communicating this sentiment. From that perspective, this scene becomes much more affecting and taps into something very real amongst the layers of conceptual obfuscation happening with things like Fox Die and so on. Guns of the Patriots at least knows to end there. The post-credits logo conversation isn't reserved for twist this time, just a reaffirmation that Snake will live for himself, with Otacon at his side. Which is a good dose of gay shit after all that fucking Naomi nonsense.
But I'll remember everything you were, and stick with you to the end.
Otacon.
Besides, you wouldn't let me suffer Sonny's eggs alone, would you?
There's a small part of me that, here at the end, wants to insist that Guns of the Patriots is actually the most compelling Metal Gear game because of how messy and complex it is. But the thing is, all Metal Gear games are messy. They're characterized by odd characters, convoluted plots, and complicated concepts. So in reality, Metal Gear Solid 4 isn't just messy, but messy in a way that never coalesces into greatness the way things do in the first 3 Solid games, and to a large extent Metal Gear 2. Despite some gameplay woes, things begin really positively. The way the consequences of the end of MGS2 have been transposed onto the world are valuable and impressively relevant, as much now as then. And as you explore the systems at play, things have been updated and appropriated for the setting in truly resonant ways. The game manages to capture really unique tones of gameplay, reflecting the war economy and methods of unequal exchange it imposes upon the globe writ large. But from there, things begin to completely fall off the rails. The methodology behind Guns of the Patriots' game-long finale quickly curdles and proves to be a fatal flaw. It's hamstrung by its own need to actually conclude, and along the way seemingly make up for the perceived mistakes of MGS2, deciding to placate the player rather than truly challenge them. As returning characters are squandered and new ones prove so impotent so as to become pointless, the gameplay begins to suffer. Overlong turret sections, dull shooting galleries, and simplistic boss fights totally distract from the strong core gameplay mechanics that are in place. Playing Metal Gear Solid 4 becomes a means to an end, literally, but by this point the story has turned itself into a laughingstock. There are some points of interesting thematic discussion and some bold creative choices, like the use of calligraphy for typography for example, but these are bright spots and only serve to shine a light on the blemishes that, through sheer number, define the experience. MGS4 makes the death of Eva, one of my favourite characters in the series, something I can just brush past in a couple sentences because she doesn't even really matter. She's here only to facilitate Snake's role in all this and provide exposition. Everything that made her so interesting in Snake Eater has been lost. What Guns of the Patriots does get right throughout the whole thing is Snake. His role as a vector for the player is sort of twisted, becoming a vector for the developers. He watches as the world, himself, and the series as a whole implodes and becomes pure spectacle. His anxiety about his future, his role, and his legacy remain relevant to initially his own reality, but as you go, increasingly ours, and specifically the idea of what a series like Metal Gear should be, and the relationships people form with it. This pseudo-metatextual, pseudo-textual exploration of Snake's place in the world is really fascinating. It feels like the richest vein in the entirety of MGS4 because it's the one case where the game itself is actually exploring something along with you. Outside of this thematic avenue, Metal Gear Solid 4 is incredibly preoccupied with telling you how things are, telling you what's happening, just telling you shit in general. But with Snake, finally, MGS4 asks you something, posits something, looks for discussion rather than validation. This is what worked about the postmodernism of MGS2. It's just such a shame that Guns of the Patriots only seems to realise that for 15 minutes every 2 hours, before at last clinging onto it once Act 5 comes around. I don't hate Metal Gear Solid 4, but there's way less to like about it and more to straight up dislike than any game in the series that came before it. The negatives are so glaring that their inclusion makes it feel like something just went wrong. It tries to weave together the series' complex web of themes, but does so in thuddingly unimaginative ways it can't justify, trying instead to distract with scale and spectacle, along the way happening onto something real with Snake and his arc. At its close, the game gets very human, allowing a spectral father figure to re-emerge and tell the main character, Snake or Kojima, that things are over now and you can move on. Despite it all, Guns of the Patriots would still manage to be an, if not great, at least appropriate, almost poetic ending for the series. If it was actually an ending.